Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for coming. Today we are honored to have Joshua Foer with us. Josh is a science journalist whose work has appeared in National Geographic, Esquire, Slate, Outside, the New York Times, and many other publications. His first book, Moonwalking with Einstein, The Art and Science of Remembering Everything, chronicles his journey of going from being a guy with just an average memory to becoming the 2006 U.S. memory champion capable of memorizing a deck of cards in 1 minute and 40 seconds. Joshua is co-founder of Atlas Obscura, an online guide to the world's wonders and curiosities, and is also co-founder of the design competition Suka City. Please join me in welcoming Joshua.
Thanks. It's so nice to be here. I guess, given that this is such an intimate setting, I think I would like to maybe chat briefly and then have a kind of conversation with you guys about a theme, a subject that is almost like this thread that goes through my book, Moonwalking with Einstein, which is the relationship between knowledge and wisdom, between memory and intelligence. And I think it's a pertinent subject to talk about at this moment in time here at Google. In Stephen Levy's book, In the Plex, about the history and culture of Google, he has your CEO, Larry Page, on the record saying that he looks forward to the day when ultimately his products, Google products, will be channeled straight into your brain, right? Where you will merely think of a question and the answer will come straight to you. In fact, someday maybe you'll have a Google implant that will connect you directly to Google services. Sergey Brin has said that ultimately Google is about augmenting your brain with sort of all the world's knowledge. And that may sound kind of like science fiction, but I'm enough of a technological determinist, and I guess have enough faith in Google to believe that that is something that may ultimately come about. And I think if you look around at sort of what's going on in the world, there are enough indicators that suggest that this is a future that's not that implausible. So already, cochlear implants have been installed in something like over 200,000 human brains. Take sound waves, turns them into electrical impulses, channels them into the brainstem, allows deaf people to hear. And you've got a number of sort of research firms all over the world, research groups, I should say, working on developing sort of primitive neural prosthetics. I did a story for Esquire a few years back about a guy called Eric Ramsey, who, when he was 16 years old, was in this absolutely tragic car accident that left him locked in. Totally took away his ability to control any part of his body beyond his eyes. But cognitively, he was totally there. And working with a scientist, a neuroscientist in Georgia, he had a set of electrodes implanted into the part of the premotor cortex that controls sort of movement of the mouth, the tongue, the lips. And the notion is that at some point they're training him to control a prosthetic voice using his thoughts. So that's sort of like one-way communication. I think the ultimate vision is some sort of a two-way communication where it's not just data coming out, but data coming into the brain. And I don't know if it's going to be Google who does this, or I don't know if it's going to happen in my lifetime. But if you look at sort of the broad trajectory of where technology is going in terms of creating an ever more seamless connection, interface between the minds that are embodied in our brains and the memories that are embodied in our technology and our devices like our smartphones, I think it's fair to say that Google has got a nice head start. And there was some reporting in the New York Times earlier this year by Nick Bilton, who suggested that you guys are working on a heads-up display that he says is going to be out by Christmas. And the notion is we'll be walking around with sort of all of this information sort of projected straight onto our retinas, which is, a much less clumsy and clunky way of tapping into the collective knowledge of mankind than using my thumbs and or even talking to my phone. And I think this is poised to be like the big story of my lifetime, of the next several decades, is how life is going to change as we really merge in a more seamless way our internal and our external minds. And I think this is actually an old story. This is, we've been figuring out better and better ways to externalize our memories and to recall them, activate them with better and better technologies, basically since the first caveman splashed paint on the wall of a cave. Once upon a time, anything that was going to be passed on had to be remembered. There was nothing to do with a thought except remember it. There was no alphabet to transcribe thoughts in, no paper to put them down upon. And anything that was going to be conveyed first had to be memorized. And then there was, of course, this massive technological shift, the invention of writing. And you had people who were objecting to that. 2,500 years ago, Socrates was at the very least ambivalent and maybe even up in arms about this new invention called writing. And he said, writing is going to make people dumb. People are going to start taking ideas out of their minds, putting them down on papyrus, and thinking that they're still smart. When, in fact, they're just going to be like empty vessels, right? They are, you can't, information, memories stored on a external source, they can't inquire of you, they can't challenge you. They're static. Real knowledge has to be sort of deeply embedded in your consciousness. And Socrates thought the culture was headed down this terrible, treacherous path that was going to end no place good. Fortunately, somebody had the good sense to write down Socrates' disdain for the written word. Otherwise, we wouldn't remember it. Thank you very much, Plato. And, well, I think we would all agree that he was overstating the case, right? We've had writing for a couple millennia. We're more inclined to see its benefits than its pitfalls. I think there's also something we can recognize in what Socrates was concerned about. Some nugget of wisdom that is especially pertinent today. And I think it has to do with the operating metaphor in how we think about memory, how we talk about memory colloquially. I think it's the operating metaphor that's embedded in the idea of these Google goggles and in so much else that we're doing with technology right now, which is this notion that our memories are like a bank, right? We deposit information into this bank when we encode it and we pull it back out at some later date. And that implies a kind of equivalence between an internal memory and an external memory, right? Actually, if I've got a bank up here and a bank here, you know, the bank that's hardware is a whole lot less likely to make mistakes. It's a whole lot more durable. It is, in almost every way, superior to the wetware that I've got up here. And I think you find that this idea, this metaphor of the memory as a bank is really sort of seeped into a lot of aspects of our life. Even in school, you find now kids saying, well, why should I learn that piece of information? I can always just Google it, right? And you even find teachers who seem to be agreeing with them. Yeah, why should we teach kids facts? Why should we teach kids content? We want to make kids into creative thinkers, into innovative thinkers, into people who can process the world. And so why should we waste our time on content? She's just going to get forgotten about anyways. And I think what we're seeing is a kind of evolution in our notion of what it means to be erudite, right? So for Socrates, erudition meant having all of these internally stored memories that were sort of always there at the forefront of his mind. I mean, all the way through the late Middle Ages, you had people thinking about writing in very different terms than we do today. People wrote things down, not as we do today, to sort of offload them so we don't have to remember things. People wrote things down to aid their memories. Writing was thought of as an aid memoir. You know, we had, there's a wonderful quote by Petrarch. He says, I ate in the morning what I digested in the afternoon. What I swallowed as a boy, I ruminated upon as an old man. I these writings were implanted not just in my memory, but in my marrow. There was this notion that to really fully engage with information deeply, it had to be sort of integrated into your soul. It's a very different sort of notion of reading than we have today. After Gutenberg, after books become mass-produced commodities, erudition evolves from having all this stuff stored internally to knowing how and where to find information in this labyrinthine world of external memories. There are now books everywhere. I'd argue that there is sort of a new kind of new stage in this evolution of erudition, which is that we no longer have to even know how and where to find stuff. We just need to know the right set of search terms, and then Google can take care of the rest. And what I guess is problematic about this metaphor of memory as a bank is that it's not really how our memories work. Our memories are not sequestered in some vault in our brain. They're actually always there. They are always shaping how we perceive the world, how we make decisions in the world, how we move through the world, our judgment. And there's this kind of continuous feedback process between our perception and our memory. Our memories are actually much less like a bank and much more like a lens that is constantly filtering the world for us and helping us to make sense of it. And I think this is something that we all kind of intuitively get. I mean, if I was to sit down next to a Google engineer and look at a website, we would see two very different things. We actually would look at the world differently because of the memories that we've got floating around in our skulls. The Google engineer would see all sorts of things that just don't have meaning to me, that aren't relevant to me, that I don't even understand. And likewise, if we took a walk in a park, because I studied evolutionary biology in college and know a little bit about the life history of trees, there are things that I pay attention to, things that direct sort of my attention that might not otherwise catch another person's. And my experience of that walk in the park is going to be qualitatively different from somebody else's. And I guess that's what is sort of the notion behind what Petrarch was saying is, look, our memories make us who we are. They're at the root of not just our self-identity, but our values, our character, our judgments, our sense of appreciation of the world. And, it's not just about information as sort of I'll tell you a story, which is that not long ago I was in Shanghai doing an assignment for National Geographic. And I went through high school not having received even the smallest bit of education about Chinese history. I didn't know that Kublai Khan was a real person, which in retrospect is kind of amazing. And I tried to make the best of this, 3 days that I had in Shanghai, and I tried to go to all the museums and, interpret the culture as best I could and make sense of the history. And what I found was that not just that I didn't know this stuff, it was that I didn't even have the ability to learn it. I didn't have the basic facts to fasten other facts to. And what that suggests is the extent to which, our memories are, my experience was impoverished, is what it points to. My experience was impoverished, and it kind of sucked. And it made me regret the fact that I didn't know anything about Chinese history. And I guess part of what makes me nervous about sort of this direction that technology, our culture seems to be going in, is that in the process of privileging this kind of memory, that we are devaluing the other kind of memory, the kind of memory that actually really matters to living a rich life, to living a good life. And, there was this study that I'm sure many of you are aware of in the journal Science last year that suggested that when people know that a piece of information is stored on the internet in a computer, that they invest less of themselves in remembering it and tend to have a worse memory for that information just because they know that it exists online. It's not that Google's making us dumb, it's that Google is making us lazy. That's what that study really suggested. And, when I think about this vision of the future that Larry Page is pre-visioning of a world in which we are constantly plugged in and constantly have the entire collective knowledge of humanity, the greater human consciousness, all sort of immediately accessible, always there, always on. I think there are going to be ways in which it's going to be truly wonderful, truly glorious. Having access to all of the world's information is incredible. But the thing that I hope we will keep in mind is that infinite knowledge is not the same thing as wisdom. And that I hope Google will keep in mind as it develops all of this technology, because over the next couple of decades, you guys are going to have a power to shape our culture and shape how humans live at a very intimate level in a way that I don't know that any institution outside of organized religion has ever had before. And I guess my hope is that what will guide you guys is a kind of humanism, right? I mean, I think this trajectory may be inevitable, but Google and maybe a few of your competitors have the power to actually guide us in some ways and to help shape the culture that we're creating together. And what would be a shame is if it is the value of technologists, of how do we make life easier, how do we make life more efficient, how do we get that extra marginal utility, which doesn't necessarily equate to the good life. If that's what's driving us, or much worse, the bottom line and maximizing shareholder profits. I hope that what will guide Google is a sense of humanism, of people asking really big questions, really old questions about what the good life really means, and what are the values that we want to perpetuate in ourselves and in humanity at large. And if you guys don't ask those questions, if Google's not asking those questions, if Apple's not asking those questions, if Facebook's not asking those questions, I fear we're going to wake up in 25 years wearing our Google goggles and having our thoughts tweeted straight into the ether, and we're going to be like that proverbial lobster that doesn't even realize that it's boiling itself to death. That we're going to wake up and we're going to say, is this really good? I know my life is more efficient, more productive, I'm more connected, I'm more my internet connection is faster, but am I really living a good life? And are my basic human needs in the biggest possible sense being met? And is this really the future that we wanted? So I guess maybe we should have a conversation about that. I'm curious to hear what you guys think, since you all are shaping that future. Hey, man. Thanks for
Hey, Josh.
How are you?
I'm good. How are you? So, I mean, I think the way that you're putting the story is really kind of a story of escalating complexity. Computers give us the power to handle more complex interactions every single day. There's just more stuff that we have to do. And of course, as soon as we get the capability to handle this, we also get the capability to add more of it, right? So in this world, how can we come to a situation where we, get the power to deal with complexity, but we don't use that power to add more complexity, right?
Well, I don't know if more complexity is necessarily bad. The question is superficial complexity, right? So, just to go back to that notion of the changing notion of how we read, right? People used to read a lot less, but they read a lot less, a lot deeper, and they really etched these ideas onto their consciousness in a way that would seem totally alien to us today. Today, you just can't do that. You can't do that and keep up because the world is more complex. You have to read widely, and that means reading superficially. And so there's always going to be that balance. The question is, we have to be conscious of when we've swung too far, when the pendulum has swung too far. So I don't know, maybe this is just something that is unstoppable, and that we're all kind of destined to be living in the Matrix in 250 years, because that's just where technology is going to take us and we don't have any control over it. But I think actually we do have some control.
Well, but how would we exercise that control? Would we exercise that control by essentially sort of constraining choice? Is the idea saying, well, you may think that you want option B more than option A, where option B is a more technologized, less humanized world. But actually, we know that you don't.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, because right. So a lot of what we're is being sort of created in the world is and by Google is like, how do we flip a little pleasure switch in your brain, or flip a little switch that gives you some sort of immediate reward, right? I actually get some immediate amount of pleasure every time I check my email. That is, I don't know why that is setting something off in me that is like, I want to constantly check it. But I suspect in the big picture, this is not a good thing that I'm constantly checking my smartphone. And so maybe for the people who are developing smartphones, they should think about that. Like, okay, so how do we create a system in which you're not incentivized to want to be looking at this thing every second? I don't know how you do that, but you need to be asking that question at the very least.
It seems like an odd position for a technological determinist to take, though. Saying that.
Well, I think this stuff. I think there is still some degree of control that we have over like the conditions in which this stuff is deployed. So, it may be inevitable that we'll all have these chips plugged in, whatever. But I think there are choices that are going to be made along the way that will shape the extent to which that is for good or for ill.
Great. I'm going to let other people.
Right. Yeah, you might want to.
I find what you say very compelling and very interesting, but I always find this an odd conflict for the following reason. You give the example, kids today are saying, why should I learn facts? I can always go Google them. Well, I remember being in high school, which was a very long time ago, and I remember making the same statement myself. And, all my friends agreeing, why should we memorize this stuff? It's all in the library. And it was sometime during college that I came to the realization that the answer to that was, well, if that's true, then that library down the block is the most intelligent being on the planet. If you don't believe that, then you shouldn't be making that statement. So it's always so easy to look at the current state and say, well, this is unprecedented. This hasn't happened before. We need to do something different because we're going in the wrong direction. But it's not like this question was new when I was in high school.
Or when Socrates was in academy.
Yeah, and somehow we've managed to muddle through, which suggests that maybe we're asking the wrong question here.
Well, first of all, I would say, I agree with you that this is an old story. That this is only sort of the latest chapter in a conversation that we've been having truly for millennia. Although things seem to be accelerating at a rate today that they weren't maybe when you were in high school. The thing I would say about, is, look, it's true. I have all the world's information a thumb click away right now. And in a sense, I know that information, right? There's a sense in which that is all sort of immediately accessible to me. And in which, if you want to take this sort of idea of like a self that spills across the boundaries of my epidermis, and this is actually part of me, okay, but your library, that is the greatest living, smartest organism on the planet, actually can't take two ideas that didn't previously go together and put them together. Can't make an insight, can't have a creative thought, can't invent anything. That still takes a human mind. And to the extent that we are impoverishing our memories because we're saying, well, I can always go look it up in the library and I don't need to fill my mind with stuff. I don't need to have a furnished brain, a furnished mind. I suspect that there are consequences to that that are very difficult to calculate.
And again, I agree with you 100%, and yet I'm concerned that we, in every generation, we look back and say, oh, the way we knew it when we were growing up, or the way our fathers knew it when we were growing up, were better. Things are falling apart now. When you have such a long history of such statements, you have to ask, are my intuitions here really right? Am I approaching this problem the right way?
Or am I actually right? Maybe actually.
Finally, after all these warnings,
What's that?
maybe, you know.
Maybe life was actually better in some qualitatively meaningful ways for my father's generation than it is for my generation. In terms
Could
of,
be.
I think if you're a kid growing up, I think there are really like reasonable arguments to be made that, you know, my nephews who are going to grow up absolutely glued to their computers are maybe not having as good of a childhood as I did.
We had TV before that and comic books before that. So, but I'll leave it at that.
Hi, thanks for coming.
Thanks.
I enjoyed your book, by the way.
Thank
It's
you.
really great. So I would say my response to you is that here's why I think it's not a big deal. It's for me to look up something on my smartphone, for example. I have a lot of externalized memories on my smartphone. It takes a long time for me to look this up. I mean, as I could probably do it in like 10 seconds, 20 seconds, but that's huge. You know, an average Google search is much smaller than 1 second. It's like, a few hundred milliseconds. And even that even if it's, 800 milliseconds, that's qualitatively worse for users. So I would say that the more latency there is before you get your answer, like you have to overcome that latency and you have to really want to know that information. In essence, it's for information when you kind of accept that latency, it's for information that's just not that important. If it was important, you'd memorize it, basically. And I think this is kind of proven by, when we interview people, we tend not to ask kind of little trivia questions that people could look up with Google, but we do ask questions that are very basic, and maybe the people could also look them up with Google, but if they were interested in the subject, they would have memorized it at this point, And so it's sort of I think what's in there's no chance of not having a lot of memorization happen because you'll memorize stuff that you're going to be interested in, and then what you're interested in is growing more complex anyway. So it's like that is just crowding up the space of the brain. Everything else goes on to smartphones, and I think we could all live with that trade-off because it's pretty efficient, actually.
Isn't that exactly the case that I'm making, though? That so once we've got the Google goggles, right? That are, I know actually Google goggles is actually the name of one of your products, which
Yes.
is image search, right?
Yes.
Which I presume is a stalking horse for when that camera is going to be sort of in my glass, and I'll immediately it'll
Maybe, I
immediately
don't
be
know.
able to search whatever I'm looking at, and I'll have met you, and I'll actually already know your name and your Facebook profile, and
That's true, but that's not that important.
no. But the thing is, the question is, right? As we sort of move towards that future, where all of this information, there is no latency, right? In fact, it'll be calling up stuff that maybe I don't even need. How is that going to change the extent to which we invest in bothering to learn information at all?
Well, I would say first of all, I'd say there's always going to be latency. Even in like if you're envisioning at 20 years where we're going to have Google goggles planted on our face at all times, even then there'll still be latency, even if it's only like a few hundred milliseconds to get answers. Like, I think it's just inevitable that thinking is always going to be faster than whatever else you're, getting information in some way and then thinking about it. And also that, for stuff that you're interested in, you want to think about it, and that involves memorization as a byproduct, even if you're not even set out to memorize it. So I think it's going to happen anyway. That is, you will memorize lots of things throughout your life.
Yeah, except people don't seem to be doing that.
I think it happens. I think it does happen. Like
you look at maybe this is another issue altogether, but you look at these statistics of kids coming out of high school in America who don't know jack squat. Like, can't tell you. 20% of American high school students can't tell you who America fought in World War II.
Yeah, but they're probably not interested in it. For example, let me give you an example that you just earlier in this when you're talking, you kind of mentioned, there's an article in the New York Times, and you mentioned the person who wrote it. Mm-hmm. You memorize that. That's all in your memory because it's really interesting to you as a writer who wrote what piece for the New York Times. Now, I heard it. It's not interesting. It is interesting, but I didn't take the time to memorize that name, right?
So I guess one response to that is: are you going to be interested in learning information when it is so immediately, shallowly available to you, right? So, for example, I'm walking through a park, right? And if I want to like take that extra moment to learn to identify whatever kind of tree this is, right? That's what that kind of depth of engagement of taking that extra moment to try and figure it out and look at the leaves and see if I can tell what the shape is and can I make sense of this. That extra engagement is what makes it memorable, that depth of processing. But if I can just walk up to it, take a picture of it, and I have that the answer sent right to my brain, right to my retina, then I'm not engaging with it very deeply. I'm engaging with it superficially, and that's not going to be memorable.
Yeah, but
we're creating a culture in which everything is kind of you're just skimming over the surface of the world because it's all coming at you, and you're getting the pleasure of knowing that answer without actually investing any of yourself in learning it. Then are we actually going to truly have real memories, or are we just going to have this kind of superstructure of external memories?
Yeah, well, I think it's all based on interests, and if you're interested, the memorization will happen. But I'll let other people talk now. Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi, a couple of quick points. Thank goodness for the bell-shaped curve, because you'll always have some of one and some of the other. If you think you have the world knowledge at your fingertips, you're sadly deluded. I have done research using Google where I've had to go to page 27 to get the correct result because the noise drowned out the signal. If you don't have the ability to think critically like that, you're just going to delude yourself. And that may be a danger, and one that I am particularly concerned about. I've raised a son who's now employed full-time about almost a year, which is quite an achievement for a college grad these days. And I was always asking him, okay, now that you figured it out, tell me what it means. Well, the poor rascal ended up studying philosophy, and it's all my fault.
But he still got a job.
He did indeed. And what you learn in philosophy is how to size up an argument quickly, size up a bunch of information quickly, and that is something Google can't do. And I doubt
Isn't
Google.
Your mission? I mean, isn't the Google mission to get if the piece of information I'm actually want is on page 27, and that is Google saying we're actually not doing a good enough job, and that our goal is to get it to number one?
Right on the money. But the way we do it, it's a popularity contest. And people have freedom of opinion, but I don't think people have freedom of truth. And that's where we fail. And what it takes to survive in an information-rich society is the ability to distinguish signal from noise. Socrates was right. You can have an information dystopia, and we've had it in history. It's been called scholasticism, where the written word superseded observables. Okay? The danger lies in the lack of critical thinking to where it truly becomes, if it's on the internet, it must be true. And we have to work to prevent that. And I think that's what you're trying to say, if I understand you correctly.
I think it's a piece of it.
Yeah, a good piece of it. Anyway, I could go on forever, but I better not.
Thank you.
Hi, thanks for coming. I have a quick comment. I mean, a lot of what you're saying here it's really interesting. There's a lot of tricky questions. It all kind of sounds like a bummer, too. One thing that occurred to me when the first questioner was up here, talking about the restriction of choice in order to, I guess, guide people towards a more enriched life. It sounds like there's an analogy with nutrition and physical health. And that what we're kind of talking about is the information and experience equivalent of junk food. That in agriculture and in food production in general, we've found ways to feed a lot more people. In the meantime, we've also created a diabetes and obesity epidemic in this country. And I think a lot of what you're saying is kind of the same thing. Like when food or information is so readily available, the people may not be making conscious, healthy decisions. And I think to some degree we are seeing the pendulum swing back a little bit more. Like people are choosing to pay more for organic food, even though there's plenty of cheap food available on the shelves. You can always feed yourself with junk food.
Yeah,
but-
I think that's a really wonderful analogy that I hadn't
Yeah.
really thought of, and may borrow from you, and instructive in a lot of ways, because I think you're actually just starting to see sort of some of that pendulum swinging back the other way in relation to our engagement with the web and with ubiquitous smartphones and stuff. I mean,
Right. I mean, I think the flip side of that is we're also we're feeding a lot more people than we ever have, and we're also educating more people than we ever have. I mean, you're talking. You mentioned some about high school students, not being able to recall facts when they graduate. There's also, I think, I don't have any numbers on this. More high school students are, graduating with a knowledge of calculus than ever did before. So, maybe we're shifting more towards skills rather than facts, and like we're talking about creative synthesis. I think you're right, though. Without a sort of a basis of knowledge, that there's nothing to synthesize, and that your brain has to have something to work with in order to be able to generate those experiences.
I think you're right. That they're all in everything we do. There are costs and benefits, and the question is, how do we think about them in relation to each other? And with respect to nutrition, like people started having a big conversation.
Right.
Like a really epically big conversation that involved scientists involved, the government involved, farmers involved, about consumers, McDonald's, Kmart.
And this really only seemed to happen like after we discovered that we have big problems.
Right.
So we may be sort of on the way up of the pendulum swing right now with this information problem, and we may have to go pretty far before, as you mentioned, like some people start to say, well, maybe this isn't right. Maybe this isn't what we want. And I think it's a small number of people still who are swinging back in the realm of nutrition. I mean, you have shows like The Biggest Loser on TV, but people are becoming aware of this, but it's still not. I mean, a lot of people are still eating really crappy food all the time, every day.
So my question is, how does Google like embed this kind of maybe it is embed this kind of big think questioning into how you guys direct your resources and think about shaping the culture in which we live?
Yeah, I think that's a big question for us. I mean, how do we continue to use technology to make our lives better rather than just easier?
Right.
Or
and
more
what is
convenient?
better?
Yeah.
So, thanks.
Yeah.
Probably take him first
Okay.
because I just came back up. Go ahead.
Thank you for coming. I haven't read your book yet, although I've read one of the articles based on your book. I think you're sort of posing a false dichotomy here. And you discussed that people know a lot of things very shallowly, whereas previously, you would read one or two books and think about them very deeply for a long time. And yet, you still see people nowadays devoting their entire lives to a single subject, a single train of thought sometimes. And kids right out of college, kids right out of high school do this. I don't know that it is so much a matter of we are being trained to think about things shallowly, to remember things shallowly, because this information is so much at our fingertips, as it is we know that we can develop the richer context in a shorter time. You talked about your trip to Shanghai, was it? Mm-hmm. That basically, you came in with no preparation and you spent 3 days going to the museums and came away with nothing because you had no context to attach it to. Whereas, in 25 years from now with your Google implant, you could spend the plane ride over developing the sort of knowledge base that 20 years ago would have taken you 3 months and 14 trips to the library to develop. Mm-hmm. And yeah, that context may not be as fully textured as the one you would have had 20 years ago, but if you retain the interest in the subject, mm-hmm. I think you can develop the richer context faster. Mm-hmm. And, you can see this with, if you've ever met a 6-year-old who's just developed an interest in dinosaurs. Within 1 month, they can rattle off 50 to 100 species, and they'll know the physical characteristics of these things. And if they retain the interest, within 3 months, they'll know, the names of the paleontologists who dug them up and like the techniques and where they were discovered. It's more a matter of, if you have the interest, the tools are becoming more available for you to develop the context, but it relies on you having the interest.
Yeah. So I really love that, and I think maybe the way to pose the question is, like, how do we use these tools to develop that kind of depth, right? So that these tools, because I'm sure that I'm very confident that in the same technology we're talking about can be used to make people have richer experiences, deeper experiences, have like fuller mental lives. And the question is, how do we design what we're creating so that it does that?
Not an easy problem. No.
Not an easy problem, but one I hope you guys will think about. Yeah.
All right, I asked earlier about, are we asking the wrong question? And I found it fascinating as the very next person came up and asked a number of questions. And as you two talked, you fell into exactly the trap you warned about earlier, which was that you talked about memory, human memory, as if it were just like, the external memory. It's just this data bank. We're talking about a series of facts. Do kids come out of high school knowing a bunch of facts? Which completely misses the point. Facts are irrelevant. That's not what we really learn. There are the classic studies by, I think it was by Simon, on expert chess players. Expert chess players have memorized thousands upon thousands of games. They can look at a board position and memorize it within seconds. But only if it's an actual board position that makes sense. If you give them a board position with just pieces randomly slotted around it, they're no better than somebody who's never seen a game of chess before. What we learn, the reason that we learn that we are able to retain facts is because we learn certain ways of thinking within which the facts fit. If you know about evolutionary biology and you look at trees, it's not the fact that you know the names of the trees. Anyone can memorize a list of names of trees. That gives them no understanding of how the trees fit together into the ecosystem, how they evolved, what's important, what's not. It doesn't seem to me that anything that you're saying about the easy availability of facts has anything whatsoever to do with our ability, and need to develop understandings. It may tempt us to think that we can be experts if we simply have access to a bunch of facts. It's not true. It never was true. The other final thing that's interesting, there's been a lot of study on this about what it takes to become an expert.
Yes.
What expertise really takes.
Moonwalking with Einstein, available in the back.
Okay. And one interesting thing about it is it takes about 10 years.
Right.
And it's always taken about 10 years. And nothing we've done has changed that.
Right.
So, why are we so worried?
No,
What is it that if you look at it in those terms, is there something about, even assume the technology trends go in the direction you're going, is there something in there that would lead you to believe that people will not become experts?
Yeah, so this is, I think this is actually the essence of it, and which is that, so with chess, right? Mm-hmm. It's not that people become chess experts from memorizing lots and lots of games. It's that the causality works in the other direction. It's that
Correct.
By having played lots of games, having been invested in the sport of chess for a long time, they develop terrific memories for chess because they have this deeper way of thinking, more context. They see dynamics, they see structure, they see all sorts of things that I don't see when I look at a chess game. And this is true of experts in every possible discipline that's ever been studied. That something about achieving expertise brings with it a terrific memory for the details of that field. The question is, when the details are easy to come by, right? When we don't have to, right? When they're just sort of fed to us, does that kind of superficial knowledge make us somehow less likely to invest in the kind of way that it would take to be a real expert, right? So if you're a chess player and you've got the answers constantly being funneled into your heads-up display, you're never going to become a good chess player.
That's right, and if your interest was in chess, you will quickly discover that that's the wrong way to go about it.
Right.
What's new here? I mean, people have been experts on baseball statistics for generations. They memorize huge numbers of baseball statistics. A completely useless piece, bit of mental stuff by any kind of outside measure. I mean, if you're into that kind of thing, you're into that kind of thing. So what? I mean, that stuff has always been there for anyone to look up. Has it made baseball any more or less interesting? Well, it's been more interesting. Actually, it's made it more interesting. The statistics draw a lot of people into the game. How has it made it less interesting? How has it made people less interested in playing the game, in watching the game?
So that's trivia, right? When we're talking about
maybe to you, maybe to me.
No, but
some people.
if we take that
Okay.
that metaphor of chess, right, which I think is a useful metaphor that we can apply more broadly to sort of all areas in which people develop hard-earned expertise, right, and a sort of a deeper way of thinking about the world, right, a deeper way of seeing. Truly, an expert chess player looks at a board differently. Activates different regions of the brain than I do when they look at the board. The question is, if the answers are always there and immediately accessible, how is that going to affect knowledge in the bigger picture in all sorts of disciplines?
I will only suggest that in your answer that, that baseball statistics is just trivia, any field in which simply having the recorded answers is sufficient is just trivia. So why worry about it?
No, I don't think that's right. I don't think that's right. I think to go back to our walk through the park, right?
But that's not sufficient. You understand things at a deeper level than someone who simply knows the names of all the trees.
Well, so one of the Google Goggles apps, I don't know if it's been developed or in development, will take a picture of a leaf and tell you what kind of tree it is, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so that is trivia.
Yeah.
But understanding why
Correct.
this leaf is
So again, and what I'm suggesting to you is, if having such a perfect app, which tells you everything about a leaf, just from taking a picture of it, defines everything there is about the field, then the field is trivia. And who cares?
The question is, will people who have all
Hasn't
this stuff
stopped.
constantly channeled into them, are they going to bother? Are they going to be like content to just get that extra little kick that they get from knowing that piece of information and moving on?
Do you see any evidence that they are?
I do. Yeah, I do. I see it in my own life, in how I browse the internet, in how I like hopscotch around, and in how I read. I see it in my own life. I don't know. Do people not see that in their own lives? That this sort of sense of I'm not really engaging as deeply as I used to, or that I could be.
Well, I can answer for myself.
I see it in personal interactions with people. That I'm, tempted to constantly be picking up my phone and looking at it, which is a form of ADD. It's like I'm not paying attention, right? My mind is elsewhere. I'm doing something else and not engaging in the way that will make my life richer, make my life better. I don't know. Yeah, thank you though.
Hi, thanks for coming to speak to us today. I really enjoyed the topic, and I appreciate the dilemma that you're bringing up of, super intelligence versus wisdom. And two sort of related thoughts. One is on the analogy of like the library being the most intelligent being, if those were the same idea. So I think the idea of the challenge that you're bringing to us is valuable, and we should be thinking about it. But at the same time, maybe it's not proper that Google should be the place that sort of solves it. We're trying to be the world's best librarian, in a sense. And what you're saying is that that's not sufficient. And I agree, I'm sure many of my colleagues agree, but it's more of a cultural question. How do we make wisdom out of intelligence? And I thought, I personally grew up in a sort of religious Jewish day school, and we always were arguing about stories, ethics, morals. We read books that were 2,000, 3,000 years old, and I think that's what the distinction that you're bringing up is, like stories versus facts. So I had my particular way of coming to that, and I'm sure everyone had their own. And I guess the thought to me is there a way of having this general discussion, a valid question, without a particular way of coming to stories. So I had my own particular background. Is there a way of having a common way of doing that to the whole culture?
See, I think that is your responsibility. I think Google has become much more than just a librarian, and it is becoming more and more intimately involved in what it means to think and to. I mean, when you talk about the goggles, by the way, maybe that's a myth. Maybe the goggles aren't even coming. But in any case,
it could.
It's cool to talk about, right? Like we're talking about a company, a technology that is mediating our direct experience of reality on a moment-by-moment basis. That's like, we're in like the realm of like the spiritual here in terms of what kind of power that technology has to can wield upon us. And I think it is Google, or whoever creates this, whether it's Apple or you guys or both of you guys, or you create it and they copy you. That's incredible power, and it brings with it incredible responsibility.
I agree with that. I didn't mean it as a way of shrugging off, we shouldn't have to worry about that. I meant more, it's a bigger question. It shouldn't be relegated to one company. And in a sense, those goggles would be the ultimate reference librarian. But that is to point out to your issue that that's not the same as knowledge. We should be coming up with a culture as a appreciation that that's merely one side of a coin or multifaceted object. That as a measure of humility, we shouldn't be thinking, oh, we can come up with a way to solve that problem. Any one company, I don't think, should have that expectation. We can become the best, fulfill our company's mission, making information universally accessible. That's different than trying to push wisdom onto everyone in the world. And I think it should remain that way.
I'm not sure that they're so separable. That's, I guess, my response.
Okay. Thanks.
Thanks. A couple more minutes. Does anybody have any other questions? Okay. Maybe we'll call it a day then. Thank you.